Hey, King of Kings, so great to be with you again. Once again, let us remember that we're looking and saying, I will be not influenced by the culture, but I will influence the culture around us. And that's what we're really called to do when we think about the Daniel dilemma. Today, we're going to be talking about what it means to inherit and how important that is. Because I think that this is an important piece for us. But first, I want to just tell you a quick story about my family. My great-grandfather was a man who was very wealthy. He was in his mid-50s, and he married my great-grandmother, who was in her 20s at that time. This was in the 1920s when they got married, and then they had their first son. And there are pictures of him in 1924 or 25 as a young lad on a tiny horse. There are pictures of him a few years later during the early Great Depression of him in a model car that's built for children. My great-grandfather was driving down to Florida for a golf trip, and he decided to open up the convertible part of his early century car. And it was a cold day, and he got a cold, which turned to pneumonia, which subsequently turned to his death in the early 1930s. He left a great inheritance to my great-grandmother, a living trust for her. That trust allowed her to live on his wealth for her entire life. It also allowed my grandfather to live on that wealth his entire life. The only job my grandfather ever had was when he was drafted into the war, and he served his time where he met my grandmother and where my grandmother gave birth to my mom. My grandfather never worked a day in his life because of his inheritance. My grandfather also lost his way because of his inheritance. Because of his own entitlement, because of all the things that he had been given, he really didn't understand or know boundaries. It meant that he lived as a young man, a middle-aged man, wild and carefree. It also meant that he really didn't own up to his own obligations. He didn't ever take care of my mom as she was a child, and even through her college years. He wanted to help her, but it would have been on his terms, and she said no thank you. It meant also that he learned to abuse some of the things of this life, alcohol and wild living. And it meant that eventually he also lost everything. My grandfather, who had more money than he knew what to do with and probably could have passed down generation to generation, died penniless and poor in a state-assisted nursing home, where he also was buried in a tomb that was bought and purchased well before his time, but had no one come to his funeral, and no one knew he was gone. And it's because of that inheritance that I believe that he took for granted the gift that he had been given. He didn't understand the hard work that came with what he had received. When I think about our lives, I think about, as Christians, what we have inherited. We are the great inheritors of faith. We are an inheritor of all of the kingdom of God. We are an inheritor of everything that God's riches are, yours and mine. But how do we live out that inheritance faithfully and honoring those who've gone before us? I think that's an important part. In our reading today from Daniel chapter 5, there's a new king on the scene. King Nebuchadnezzar, he had ruled for 43 years, and now he's dead. And his grandson, who's King Belshazzar, but we'll call him King Bel because it's just a little bit easier. So King Bel is the grandson of King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, in the passages, he calls him father. That was a very common term. It's not his dad, it's his grandfather. Now, he's living and inheriting this king and this kingdom that is all things that he didn't work for. He's just now enjoying it. Get this. Here's what's happening around him. There's an army that is surrounding his kingdom. He's in danger. But in Daniel chapter 5, it says that he has a banquet for 1,000 of his nobles, and they drink wine. And while Belshazzar is drinking wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and the silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his grandfather, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nation and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Now, he's got an army surrounding him. And he's partying it up. He's living out his wildest dreams. He's got a false sense of security in his inheritance. I mean, it's pretty mighty. It says that the walls around the kingdom, the outer walls, are 17 miles long. It says that they are 23 feet high, 90 feet thick. The guard towers are over 100 feet taller than that. And it says that the gates are made of bronze, and the inner and outer walls and moats are all throughout the kingdom. So he's got this false sense of security. He thinks he's going to be okay with his inheritance. But here's the thing. He's not. Because he too has a dream. And he needs that dream interpreted. Now it's interesting. So when Daniel interpreted the dreams for his grandfather, King Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel interpreted them with great care and love. He wasn't hesitant to interpret them for King Neb out of fear of what King Neb would do. He interpreted them with a heartfelt desire that King Neb would know who God is. He interpreted them with pain, knowing that these were hard things, but King Neb needed them to come back to the Lord. So in Daniel chapter 5, he says to the king, as the king says, Daniel, interpret these, and he first calls wise men. He does all the same things of his previous history. Calls the wise men who say, we don't know, and then it's his grandmother who says, don't forget about Daniel. And Daniel comes, and Daniel tells him clearly. He says to him, here's what it is. Here's what it means. You're going to lose your kingdom. And you're going to lose everything. And Daniel tells him, matter-of-factly, blankly, because Daniel doesn't respect this king who's inherited something so great and doesn't honor who's gone before him. You know, I think when we think about what we've inherited, I can't help but think we have to think about the fact that it's so easy for us to just kind of take our faith for granted. I got to tell you, when I think about me, I think about how easy it is for me to lose sight of the sacrifices of those who've gone before me who didn't know who Jesus was. You see, I think for you and I as those, if you've grown up all your life in the church, sometimes it's hard for us to think about those who've lived outside the church. And when we find people who've lived outside the church and who come into the church, they're almost that first generation. And man, they hold on to it. And then they pass that down to a child, and they never stop speaking and sharing and showing. I think we have two responsibilities. First, as the ones who are passing on the faith to our children and to our grandchildren, let us never lose our responsibility to share what a gift we have and what a gift we've been giving and receiving. And then as those who've received that faith, let us never take for granted the gift and the work that was done before that. Let us never lose sight of the reality of the work and the effort of Jesus Christ. I think if we look back and we see what those who fought so hard to share the love of Jesus Christ, from the disciples, who all of them lost their lives with the exception of John, who was isolated on an island, to the early church fathers, to the martyrs of the Middle Ages, to those in our own country who stood firm and who shared the love of Jesus Christ, and even to those of the world today who are martyred for their faith in countries like India and Pakistan, in the Middle East, and even in our own country here, where we're not always free to share the love of Jesus. We've been given a great faith, a faith that is to be lived out. You know, when I think about my grandfather, I'm so sad for him that he never was able to see and cultivate a life of generosity, a life of gratitude. But instead, what he had been given was something that turned into him a life of entitlement. And I think about that when I think about my own faith, and even the faith that I pray my children hold on to, and I pray my grandchildren and great-grandchildren know as well. May they never see an entitlement, but instead to see a gratitude for the great joy that they have to serve, to share, and to love Jesus and stand alongside him. So today, let us be inheritors of the faith, and let us be sharers of the great gift we have that's a guarantee through the life of Jesus Christ. God bless you. God bless your week. We'll see you next week.